Western Christendom, rebuilding in the wake of Roman collapse. The western half of the European Christian world followed a rather different path than that of the Byzantine Empire. For much of the third wave millennium, it was distinctly on the margins of world history, partly because of its geographic location at the far western end of the Eurasian landmass. Thus, it was at a distance from the growing roots of world trade, by sea in the Indian Ocean and by land across the Silk Roads to China and the sand roads to West Africa. Not until the eastern and western hemispheres were joined after 1500 did Western Europe occupy a geographically central position in the global network. Internally, Europe's geography made political unity difficult. It was a region in which population centers were divided by mountain ranges and dense forests, as well as by 5 major peninsulas and 2 large islands, Britain and Ireland. However, its extensive coastlines and interior river systems facilitated exchange within Europe, while a moderate climate, plentiful rainfall, and fertile soils enabled a productive agriculture that could support a growing population. Political life in Western Europe. In the early centuries of this era, history must have seemed more significant than geography, for the Roman Empire, long a fixture of the Western Mediterranean region, was gone. The traditional date marking the collapse of the empire is 476, when the German general Odoacer overthrew the last Roman emperor in the West. In itself not very important, this event has come to symbolize a major turning point in the West, for much that had characterized Roman civilization also weakened, declined, or disappeared in the several centuries before and after 476. Any semblance of large-scale centralized rule vanished. Disease and warfare reduced Western Europe's population by more than 25%. Land under cultivation contracted, while forests, marshland, and wasteland expanded. Urban life too diminished sharply, as Europe reverted to a largely rural existence. Rome at its height was a city of 1 million people, but by the 10th century it numbered perhaps 10,000. Public buildings crumbled from lack of care. Outside Italy, long-distance trade dried up as Roman roads deteriorated and money exchange gave way to barter in many places. Literacy lost ground as well. Germanic peoples, whom the Romans had viewed as barbarians, Goths, Visigoths, Franks, Lombards, Angles, Saxons, now emerged as the dominant peoples of Western Europe. In the process, Europe's center of gravity moved away from the Mediterranean toward the north and west. Yet much that was classical or Roman persisted, even as a new order emerged in Europe. On the political front, a series of regional kingdoms led by Visigoths in Spain, Franks in France, Lombards in Italy, and Angles and Saxons in England arose to replace Roman authority. But many of these Germanic peoples, originally organized in small kinship-based tribes with strong warrior values, had already been substantially Romanized. Contact with the Roman Empire in the first several centuries CE had generated more distinct ethnic identities among them, militarized their societies, and given greater prominence to Woden, their god of war. As Germanic peoples migrated into or invaded Roman lands, many were deeply influenced by Roman culture, especially if they served in the Roman army. On the funeral monument of one such person was a telling inscription: "I am a Frank by nationality, but a Roman soldier under arms." The prestige of things Roman remained high, even after the empire itself had collapsed. Now, as leaders of their own kingdoms, the Germanic rulers actively embraced written Roman law, using fines and penalties to provide order and justice in their new states in place of feuds and vendettas. One Visigoth ruler named Ataulf, who had married a Roman noblewoman, gave voice to the continuing attraction of Roman culture and its empire. At first, I wanted to erase the Roman name and convert all Roman territory into a Gothic empire. But long experience has taught me that, without law, a state is not a state. Therefore, I have more prudently chosen the different glory of reviving the Roman name with Gothic vigor, and I hope to be acknowledged by posterity as the initiator of a Roman restoration. Several of the larger, though relatively short-lived Germanic kingdoms also had aspirations to recreate something of the unity of the Roman Empire. Charlemagne, ruler of the Carolingian Empire, occupying what is now France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and parts of Germany and Italy, erected an embryonic imperial bureaucracy, standardized weights and measures, and began to act like an imperial ruler. On Christmas Day of the year 800, he was crowned as a new Roman emperor by the Pope, although his realm splintered shortly after his death. Later, Otto I of Saxony gathered much of Germany under his control, saw himself as renewing Roman rule, and was likewise invested with the title of emperor by the Pope. Otto's realm, subsequently known as the Holy Roman Empire, was largely limited to Germany and soon proved little more than a collection of quarreling principalities. Though unsuccessful in reviving anything approaching Roman imperial authority, these efforts testify to the continuing appeal of the classical world, even as a new political system of rival kingdoms blended Roman and Germanic elements. Society and the Church. Within these new kingdoms, a highly fragmented and decentralized society widely known as feudalism emerged with great local variation. In thousands of independent, self-sufficient, and largely isolated land estates, or manors, power, political, economic, and social, was exercised by a warrior elite of landowning lords. In the constant competition of these centuries, lesser lords and knights swore allegiance to greater lords or kings, and thus became their vassals, frequently receiving lands and plunder in return for military service. Such reciprocal ties between superior and subordinate were also important at the bottom of the social hierarchy, as Roman-style slavery gradually gave way to serfdom. Unlike slaves, serfs were not the personal property of their masters, could not be arbitrarily thrown off their land, and were allowed to live in families. However, they were bound to their masters' estates as peasant laborers and owed various payments and services to the lord of the manor. One family on a manor near Paris in the 9th century owed 4 silver coins, wine, wood, 3 hens, and 15 eggs per year. Women generally were required to weave cloth and make clothing for the lord, while men labored in the lord's fields. In return, the serf family received a small farm and such protection as the lord could provide. In a violent and insecure world, adjusting to the absence of Roman authority, the only security available to many individuals or families lay in these communities, where the ties to kin, manor, and lord constituted the primary human loyalties. It was a world apart from the stability of life in imperial Rome, or its continuation in Byzantium. Also filling the vacuum left by the collapse of empire was the Church, later known as Roman Catholic, yet another link to the now defunct Roman world. Its hierarchical organization of popes, bishops, priests, and monasteries was modeled on that of the Roman Empire, and took over some of its political, administrative, educational, and welfare functions. Latin continued as the language of the Church, even as it gave way to various vernacular languages in common speech. In fact, literacy in the classical languages of Greek and Latin remained the hallmark of educated people in the West well into the 20th century. Like the Buddhist establishment in China, the Church subsequently became quite wealthy, with reformers often accusing it of forgetting its central spiritual mission. It also provided a springboard for the conversion of Europe's many pagan peoples. Numerous missionaries commissioned by the Pope, monasteries, or already converted rulers fanned out across Europe, generally pursuing a top-down strategy. Frequently it worked, as local kings and warlords found status and legitimacy in association with a literate and civilized religion that still bore something of the grandeur that was Rome. With the wealth and protection of the powerful, ordinary people followed their rulers into the fold of the Church. This process was similar to Buddhism's appeal for the nomadic rulers of northern and western China following the collapse of the Han Dynasty. Christianity, like Buddhism, also bore the promise of superior supernatural powers, and its spread was frequently associated with reported miracles of healing, rainfall, fertility, and victory in battle. But it was not an easy sell. Outright coercion was sometimes part of the process. More often, however, softer methods prevailed. The Church proved willing to accommodate a considerable range of earlier cultural practices, absorbing them into an emerging Christian tradition. For example, amulets and charms to ward off evil became medals with the image of Jesus or the Virgin Mary. Traditionally sacred wells and springs became the site of churches, and festivals honoring ancient gods became Christian holy days. December 25th was selected as the birthday of Jesus, for it was associated with the winter solstice, the coming of more light, and the birth or rebirth of various deities in pre-Christian European traditions. By 1100, most of Europe had embraced Christianity. Even so, for centuries, priests and bishops had to warn their congregations against the worship of rivers, trees, and mountains, and for many people, ancient gods, monsters, trolls, and spirits still inhabited the land. The spreading Christian faith, like the new political framework of European civilization, was a blend of many elements. Church authorities and the nobles or warriors who exercised political influence reinforced each other. Rulers provided protection for the papacy and strong encouragement for the faith. In return, the Church offered religious legitimacy for the powerful and the prosperous. It is the will of the Creator, declared the teaching of the Church, that the higher shall always rule over the lower. Each individual and class should stay in its place and perform its tasks. But church and political authorities competed as well as cooperated, for they were rival centers of power in post-Roman Europe. Particularly controversial was the right to appoint bishops and the Pope himself. This issue, known as the investiture conflict, was especially prominent in the 11th and 12th centuries. Was the right to make such appointments the responsibility of the Church alone, or did kings and emperors also have a role? In the compromise that ended the conflict, the Church won the right to appoint its own officials, while secular rulers retained an informal and symbolic role in the process. Accelerating change in the West. The pace of change in this emerging civilization picked up considerably in the several centuries after 1000. For many centuries before this, the world of European Christendom had been subject to repeated invasions. The incursion of Germanic peoples had accompanied the decline and fall of the Western Roman Empire. In the 5th century CE, the Central Asian Huns had penetrated as far as France and briefly, under the leadership of Attila, established a large state across much of Central and Eastern Europe. Muslim armies had conquered Christian North Africa and Spain and threatened the rest of Europe. In the 9th and 10th centuries, Magyar, Hungarian invasions from the east and Viking incursions from the north likewise disrupted and threatened post-Roman Europe. But by the year 1000, these invasions had been checked. The invaders had been absorbed into settled society and in some cases had converted to Christianity. The greater security and stability that came with relative peace arguably opened the way to an accelerating tempo of change. The climate also seemed to cooperate. A generally warming trend after 750 reached its peak in the 11th and 12th centuries, enhancing agricultural production, especially in northern and highland regions. Whatever may have launched this new phase of European civilization, commonly called the High Middle Ages, the signs of expansion and growth were widely evident. The population of Europe grew from perhaps 35 million in 1000 to about 80 million in 1340. With more people, many new lands were opened for cultivation in a process paralleling China's expansion to the south at the same time. Great lords, bishops, and other religious orders organized new villages on what had recently been forest or wasteland. Marshes were drained in many regions, and land was reclaimed from the sea, especially along the North Sea coast. Warmer weather during the summer months allowed farmers and pastoralists to herd their flocks into previously wild highland regions. Everywhere trees were felled at tremendous rates to clear agricultural land and to use as fuel for building material. By 1300, the forest cover of Europe had been reduced to about 20% of the land area. I believe that the forest covers the land to no purpose, declared a German abbot, and hold this to be an unbearable harm. These developments took a heavy toll on both the terrestrial and aquatic environments. Deforestation, overfishing, human waste, and the proliferation of new watermills and their associated ponds damaged freshwater ecosystems in many places. Lamenting the declining availability of fish, the French King Philip IV declared in 1289, "Today each and every river and waterside of our realm, large and small, yields nothing." The increased production associated with this agricultural expansion stimulated a considerable growth in long-distance trade, much of which had dried up in the aftermath of the Roman collapse. One center of commercial activity lay in northern Europe, from England to the Baltic coast, and involved the exchange of wood, beeswax, furs, rye, wheat, salt, cloth, and wine. The other major trading network centered on northern Italian towns, such as Florence, Genoa, and Venice. Their trading partners were the more established civilizations of Islam and Byzantium, and the primary objects of trade included silks, drugs, precious stones, and spices from Asia. At great trading fairs, particularly those in the Champagne area of France near Paris, merchants from northern and southern Europe met to exchange the products of their respective areas, such as northern woolens for Mediterranean spices. Thus, the self-sufficient communities of earlier centuries increasingly forged commercial bonds amongst themselves and with more distant peoples. The population of towns and cities likewise grew on the sites of older Roman towns, at trading crossroads and fortifications, and around cathedrals all over Europe. Some towns had only a few hundred people, but others became larger. In the early 1300s, London had about 40,000 people, Paris had approximately 80,000, and Venice by the end of the 14th century could boast perhaps 150,000. To keep these figures in perspective, Constantinople housed some 400,000 people in 1000, Cordoba in Muslim Spain about 500,000, the Song dynasty capital of Hangzhou more than 1 million in the 13th century, and the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan perhaps 200,000 by 1500. Nonetheless, urbanization was proceeding apace in Europe, though never hosting more than 10% of Europe's population. These towns gave rise to and attracted new groups of people, particularly merchants, bankers, artisans, and university-trained professionals, such as lawyers, doctors, and scholars. Many of these groups, including university professors and students, organized themselves into guilds, associations of people pursuing the same line of work, to regulate their respective professions. Thus, from the rural social order of lord and peasant, a new, more productive and complex division of labor took shape in European society. A further sign of accelerating change in the West lay in the growth of territorial states with more effective institutions of government commanding the loyalty, or at least the obedience, of their subjects. Since the disintegration of the Roman Empire, European loyalties had focused on the family, the manor, or the religious community, but seldom on the state. Great lords may have been recognized as kings, but their authority was extremely limited and was exercised through a complex and decentralized network of feudal relationships with earls, counts, barons, and knights who often felt little obligation to do the king's bidding. But in the 11th through 13th centuries, the nominal monarchs of Europe gradually and painfully began to consolidate their authority, and the outlines of French, English, Spanish, Scandinavian, and other states began to appear, each with its own distinct language and culture. Royal courts and fledgling bureaucracies were established, and groups of professional administrators appeared. Such territorial kingdoms were not universal, however. In Italy, city-states flourished as urban areas grew wealthy and powerful, whereas the Germans remained divided among a large number of small principalities within the Holy Roman Empire. These changes, which together represented the making of a new civilization, had implications for the lives of countless women and men. Economic growth and urbanization initially offered European women substantial new opportunities. Women were active in a number of urban professions, such as weaving, brewing, milling grain, midwifery, small-scale retailing, laundering, spinning, and prostitution. In 12th century Paris, for example, a list of 100 occupations identified 86 as involving women workers, of which 6 were exclusively female. In England, women worked as silver weavers, hat makers, tailors, brewers, and leather processors, and were entitled to train female apprentices in some of these trades. In Frankfurt, about 1/3 of the crafts and trades were entirely female, another 40% were dominated by men, and the rest were open to both. Widows of great merchants sometimes continued their husband's business, and one of them, Rose Burford, lent a large sum of money to the King of England to finance a war against Scotland in 1318. Much as economic and technological change in China had eroded female silk production, by the 15th century, artisan opportunities were declining for European women as well. Most women's guilds were gone, and women were restricted or banned from many others. Even brothels were run by men. In England, guild regulations now outlawed women's participation in manufacturing particular fabrics and forbade their being trained on new and larger weaving machines. Women might still spin thread, but the more lucrative and skilled task of weaving fell increasingly to men. Technological progress may have been one reason for this change. Water and animal-powered grain mills replaced the hand grinding previously undertaken by women, and larger looms making heavier cloth replaced the lighter looms that women had worked. Men increasingly took over these professions and trained their sons as apprentices, making it more difficult for women to remain active in these fields. The church had long offered some women an alternative to home, marriage, family, and rural life. As in Buddhist lands, substantial numbers of women, particularly from aristocratic families, were attracted to the secluded monastic life of poverty, chastity, and obedience within a convent, in part for the relative freedom from male control that it offered. Here was one of the few places where women might exercise authority as abbesses of their orders and obtain a measure of education. The 12th century abbess Hildegard of Bingen, for example, won wide acclaim for her writings on theology, medicine, botany, and music. But by 1300, much of the independence that such abbesses and their nuns had enjoyed was curtailed, and male control tightened, even as veneration of the Virgin Mary swept across Western Christendom. Restrictions on women hearing confessions, preachings, and chanting the gospel were now more strictly enforced. The educational activities of monastic centers, where men and women could both participate, now gave way to the new universities, where only ordained men could study and teach. Furthermore, older ideas of women's intellectual inferiority, the impurity of menstruation, and their role as sexual temptresses were mobilized to explain why women could never be priests and must operate under male control. Another religious opportunity for women operating outside of monastic life and the institutional church was that of the Beguines. These were groups of lay women, often from poorer families in Northern Europe, who lived together, practiced celibacy, and devoted themselves to weaving and to working with the sick, the old, and the poor. Though widely respected for their piety and service, their independence from the church hierarchy prompted considerable opposition from both religious and secular authorities suspicious of women operating outside of male control, and the movement gradually faded away. More acceptable to male authorities was the role of anchoress, a woman who withdrew to a locked cell, usually attached to a church, where she devoted herself to prayer and fasting. Some anchoresses gained reputations for great holiness and were much sought after for spiritual guidance. The English mystic and anchoress Julian of Norwich, for example, acquired a considerable public prominence and spiritual influence, even as she emphasized the feminine dimension of the divine and portrayed Jesus as a mother who feeds us with himself. Thus, tightening male control of women took place in Europe, as it did in Song Dynasty China at about the same time. Accompanying this change was new understanding of masculinity, at least in the growing towns and cities. No longer able to function as warriors protecting their women, men increasingly defined themselves as providers. A man's role was to brave the new marketplaces to win wealth for himself and his children. In one popular tale, a woman praised her husband. He was a good provider. He knew how to rake in the money and how to save it. By 1450, the English word husband had become a verb meaning to keep or to save. Europe outward bound, the crusading tradition. Accompanying the growth of a new European civilization after 1000 were efforts to engage more actively with both near and more distant neighbors. This medieval expansion of Western Christendom took place as the Byzantine world was contracting under pressure from the West, from Arab invasion, and later from Turkish conquest. The western half of Christendom was on the rise, while the eastern part was in decline. It was a sharp reversal of their earlier trajectories. Expansion, of course, has been characteristic of virtually every civilization and has taken a variety of forms: territorial conquest, empire building, settlement of new lands, vigorous trading initiatives, and missionary activity. European civilization was no exception. As population mounted, settlers cleared new land, much of it on the eastern fringes of Europe. The Vikings of Scandinavia, having raided much of Europe, set off on a maritime transatlantic venture around 1000 that briefly established a colony in Newfoundland in North America, and more durably in Greenland and Iceland. As Western economies grew, merchants, travelers, diplomats, and missionaries brought European society into more intensive contact with more distant peoples and with Eurasian commercial networks. By the 13th and 14th centuries, Europeans had direct, though limited, contact with India, China, and Mongolia. Europe clearly was outward bound. Nothing more dramatically revealed European expansiveness and the religious passions that informed it than the Crusades, a series of holy wars that captured the imagination of Western Christendom for several centuries, beginning in 1095. In European thinking and practice, the Crusades were wars undertaken at God's command and authorized by the Pope as the Vicar of Christ on earth. They required participants to swear a vow and in return offered an indulgence, which removed the penalties for any confessed sins, as well as various material benefits, such as immunity from lawsuits and a moratorium on the repayment of debts. Any number of political, economic, and social motives underlay the Crusades, but at their core, they were religious wars. Within Europe, the amazing support for the Crusades reflected an understanding of them as providing security against mortal enemies threatening the spiritual health of all Christendom and all Christians. Crusading drew on both Christian piety and the warrior values of the elite, with little sense of contradiction between these impulses. The most famous crusades were those aimed at wresting Jerusalem and the holy places associated with the life of Jesus from Islamic control and returning them to Christendom. Beginning in 1095, wave after wave of crusaders from all walks of life and many countries flocked to the eastern Mediterranean, where they temporarily carved out 4 small Christian states, the last of which was recaptured by Muslim forces in 1291. Later supported by an assortment of kings, popes, bishops, monks, lords, nobles, and merchants, the Crusades demonstrated a growing European capacity for organization, finance, transportation, and recruitment, made all the more impressive by the absence of any centralized direction for the project. They also demonstrated considerable cruelty. The seizure of Jerusalem in 1099 was accompanied by the slaughter of many Muslims and Jews as the Crusaders made their way to the tomb of Christ, according to no doubt exaggerated reports, through streets littered with corpses and ankle-deep in blood. Crusading was not limited to targets in the Islamic Middle East, however. Those Christians who waged war for centuries to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim hands were likewise declared crusaders, with a similar set of spiritual and material benefits. So too were Scandinavian and German warriors, who took part in wars to conquer, settle, and convert lands along the Baltic Sea. The Byzantine Empire and Russia, both of which followed Eastern Orthodox Christianity, were also on the receiving end of Western crusading, as were Christian heretics, Jews, and various enemies of the Pope in Europe itself. Crusading, in short, was a pervasive feature of European expansion, which persisted as Europeans began their oceanic voyages in the 15th century and beyond. Surprisingly, perhaps, the Crusades had little lasting impact, either politically or religiously, in the Middle East. European power was not sufficiently strong or long-lasting to induce much conversion, and the small European footholds there had come under Muslim control by 1300. The penetration of Turkic-speaking peoples from Central Asia and the devastating Mongol invasions of the 13th century was far more significant in Islamic history than were the temporary incursions of European Christians. In fact, Muslims largely forgot about the Crusades until the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when their memory was revived in the context of a growing struggle against European imperialism. In Europe, however, crusading in general and interaction with the Islamic world in particular had very significant long-term consequences. Spain, Sicily, and the Baltic regions were brought permanently into the world of Western Christendom, while the declining Byzantium was further weakened by the Crusaders' sacking of Constantinople in 1204 and left even more vulnerable to Muslim Turkish conquest. In Europe itself, popes strengthened their position, at least for a time, in their continuing struggles with secular authorities. Tens of thousands of Europeans came into personal contact with the Islamic world, from which they picked up a taste for the many luxury goods available there, stimulating a demand for Asian goods. They also learned techniques for producing sugar on large plantations using slave labor, a process that had incalculable consequences in later centuries as Europeans transferred the plantation system to the Americas. Muslim scholarship, together with Greek learning that it incorporated, also flowed into Europe, largely through Spain and Sicily. If the cross-cultural contacts born of crusading opened channels of trade, technology transfer, and intellectual exchange, they also hardened cultural barriers between peoples. The rift between Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism deepened further and remains to this day a fundamental divide in the Christian world. Christian anti-Semitism was both expressed and exacerbated as crusaders on their way to Jerusalem found time to massacre Jews, regarded as Christ killers, in a number of European cities, particularly in Germany. Such pogroms, however, were not sanctioned by the Church. A leading figure in the Second Crusade, Bernard of Clairvaux, declared, "It is good that you march against the Muslims, but anyone who touches a Jew to take his life is as touching Jesus himself." European empire building, especially in the Americas, continued the crusading notion that God wills it. And more recently, over the past 2 centuries, as the world of the Christian West and that of Islam collided, both sides found many occasions for which images of the Crusades however distorted, proved politically popular or ideologically useful.